Great. Okay, Junjiao, you are the maestro.
Yeah, so let me get started. Okay, so you all get the link I sent in the chat, right? So
I got to pull it up. Yeah, I got it.
I can also share my screen, I think. Let's see. So could you see my screen now?
Yes.
Okay, great. Yeah, so my presentation is about Margaret Gilbert's paper, which is also connected to shared intention and public intention and shared intention, which is our topic last week. So Gilbert defined in this paper, like the topic will be a shared intention. And a shared intention defined by her is like what people refer to when they utter every day using the form "we intend to do something." So she gave us some clarification on the topic, which is like in this paper, she wants to talk about the shared intention restricted to particular individuals. And she wants to talk about intentions of the future. So, and this is related to any comments on this paper, because I'm a little confused how this framework can be extended to a more formal group, not only like a small group of particular individuals. So in the actual paper, Gilbert developed her idea against Michael Bratman's perspective, which she labeled as personal intentions perspective. So for the personal intentions perspective, it is like what is quoted here with respect to a group of consisting of you and me, and concerning joint activity J, we intend to J if and only if I like several conditions. First is like both of us intend to do J, and I think another condition is like both of us know, like each of us, the other of us intend to do J. So this is what Michael Bratman's discussion of like what is something called shared intention. Is something like interlocking personal intentions. So Gilbert is not satisfied with interlocking personal intention interpretation of the shared intentions. And Gilbert gave us a new account, which she called a plural subject account. So it is defined as members of some population P share an intention to do A if and only if they are jointly committed to intend as a body to do A. So two key terms here. The first is jointly committed to, and the second is as a body. So what is commitment here? She means like Gilbert means like when you have a commitment. When we have a commitment, the person in question has sufficient reason to act in a particular way. If all else being equal, one ought to do so. This is what she called commitment. It's a rational requirement in some way. And she particularly talked about like it's not only about personal commitment. It's about joint commitments. And by joint commitment here, she means like each of the two or more people must openly express his or her personal readiness jointly with others to commit them all in a certain way. And they must commit them as one body, like a single body that intends to do the thing in question. So this is what Gilbert gave us, what she called like a plural subject account. So she, in actual paper, she gave us first like 3 criterion to judge which kind of account of shared intention is better than another. And the 3 criteria, like the first is called disjoint criterion. Like the second is called concurrence criterion, and the third is called obligation criterion. And you can find the exact definition here on the slide. So I don't want to repeat that. And as you can guess, like Gilbert thinks her account, her plural subject account, is better than Bratman's personal intention account, according to each of the 3 criterion. But actually, I am not sure how the plural subject account can meet the disjunction criterion, because like Gilbert says, a shared intention is a matter of joint commitment. It's logically possible for it to exist in the absence of correlative personal intentions of the participants. Like when nobody of us know like another of our group have the same criterion. For Gilbert, she seemed to think like the plural subject account of sharing intention can also exist. But actually, I don't know how, I cannot think of an example of how that works. So some of my ending remarks and questions. So from my point of view, so I was trained as a sociologist. So I think it's a quite like a philosophical justification for collective action, for collective intention as social facts and something we will call relational entity, which has its origin from Durkheim. But if we follow this line of thinking, we might think of like what will be the relationship between the commitment towards a micro foundation and methodological individualism, and such a like so-called relational ontology. What's the relationship between like methodological individualism or ontological individualism and social realism, or what's so-called Durkheimian worldview of the social world? So can we still accept the idea of seeking micro foundation when we accept that intentions can be ontologically super individual? And another like just feeling I have is like it is such kind of interpretation requires a very strong condition for a social group to be named. Like, how should we extend the idea beyond a group composed of a small number of people? We can say they are only quasi groups, but addressing the issue in that way make me like feel that it is too defensive. It's not very constructive in addressing like large scale collective action and more formal social organization and groups. So yeah, that's my presentation.
So those criticisms, Junqiao, seem very correct to me. I don't know if you can be very correct. I guess it's just correct or not correct. Those seem like good criticisms of her point of view. I was really happy that you highlighted, and good presentation, by the way. Thank you, Junqiao. There are a couple of questions I want to raise about it and have some discussion with all of us about this. But you highlight her polemic with regard to Michael Bratman and Bratman's parallel concept of interlocking personal intentions. And the question which I'd like to pose for all of us, really goes all the way back to McAdam, Tarot, Tilley, dynamics of contention, the dynamics through which groups come together and mobilize and then achieve collective action. My question for all of us, but for Junqiao in particular, is do we need something as strong as Gilbert's we intentions in order to make sense of what these empirical sociologists are describing? Or is Bratman's conception perfectly satisfactory? We don't have to go beyond Bratman's idea of interlocking personal intentions. Then we can account for mobilization, affiliation, identity, intertwining, communication leading to a greater level of assurance. All of these are things which fall within the scope of interlocking personal intentions. So I'm basically agreeing with you, Junqiao, that her approach seems like a philosophically, it's almost like it's overly precise. What is it doing? Does it help us with any sociologically important problem? Or can we use a more intuitive conception of social cooperation like Bratman's, or maybe like Tilley's or McAdam's, and still have a perfectly satisfactory theory of contentious politics or collective action or coordination and competition around social goods? So that's my first question. I have another question too, but let's pause on this one. Comments from you all or from Junqiao? Junqiao,
start.
Yeah, go ahead.
Oh,
Yeah,
I was just going to say, I feel like this is coming back to a problem that we were talking about last week, because like the account of Tuomela, there seems to be some kind of, this seems to work very well when we have these very, very tightly defined groups. But these tightly defined groups are not sociologically meaningful. And I think that's what we're struggling with in both papers, is the sense in which, this might be a good account of what collective intention is, but potentially in terms of small groups of people who know each other well, and a pair of people who intend to go and play a game of tennis was my example last week, right? But it doesn't help us when we're talking about sociologically relevant action. And I feel like there's something parallel about the Gilbert argument in that sense.
I think of Yilun's research on Hong Kong and the fact that tens of thousands of people over the past 10 years or so have been mobilized around a number of political values. But it's not a consensus. It's not one consensus which all, let's say, 10,000 people share. And maybe the number, maybe I'm off by an order of magnitude, maybe it's 100,000 people. Rather, there are multiple political values, political schemes, utopias, theories of democracy, and so forth. So there is no we intention in a large politically engaged group. Rather, there are multiple kind of motivating ideologies and ideas and identities. I'll pause for a second, ask Yilun. Yilun, does that make sense to you in terms of your empirical study of Hong Kong democracy politics?
I'm not sure, like, in terms of I'm trying to make a distinction between values and commitments, and like I'm pretty sure that commitment exists if you want to measure that by doing a couple of interviews, or like make some interpretation based on surveys that they conduct city-wide.
Right. So commitment to taking some kind of action, right?
Yeah. I'm sure that that's certainly the case. But
Junqiao, that would not be enough to establish a we intention, right? According to the criteria that you just described.
Yeah, Gilbert, yeah, the requirement is very strong. You have to openly express, and there must be a quite unified, like unified commitment, which everybody shows strong support in order to what so-called shared intention exists here. Yeah, very strong commitment.
I think this raises another relevant and I think interesting question. Because some of the, I guess we have touched upon this before, because some of the collective action are not like expressively expressed in the way that it can be well recognized. Say, I guess Dan brought this up several times, the work that James Scott did, let's say in Southeast Asia. It's you can't confront the authorities directly. You need to like play some kind of you don't want to be recognized that this is a confrontation or like a rebellion, but you want to show somewhat your some kind of orientation.
Right.
And it seems like that kind of collective action is not would violate a definition that Gilbert offers here,
Right.
according to Jun Chao.
And that's because the individuals with a we intention, it's entirely transparent. If Jun Chao and Emily and Ilun have a we intention to do something, then each of them understands what the other understands, really very precisely, down to a very detailed description. And each understands that the other has committed to exactly that plan. Whereas Bratman takes the view, which I think, Ilun, is completely compatible with what you were saying, ultimately, the movement has to do with some goal. That's true. So some kind of goal is shared, but assumptions about how to achieve it, even why to achieve it, those assumptions are not shared in many movements. I think it's probably true in Hong Kong, but it's true in the Solidarity movement in Poland, in Warsaw. Some factions were expressly anti-communist, and others were pro-communist, but wanting reform, wanting more democracy within communism. And yet others were more meat and potatoes. I forget what we call American unions, but kind of materially based. We just want better working conditions for workers. Well, those are three different ideas about what kind of change the Solidarity movement was pursuing. And it isn't necessary to have one transparently shared story among these 100,000 Polish workers in order for them to engage in collective action. Rather, you can have a tapestry of views which are, for a long part of the journey, compatible, though maybe not in the long term compatible. We talked about that conflict which arose in the Russian Revolution, for example, where one faction was completely revolutionary, another faction was more reform, democratic faction. And the separation of factions is a breaking down of collective purpose. But these clever, these smart people like Tilley and McAdam, they understand that social movements are always like that. There's essentially no, I don't know, maybe I'm overstating this, and maybe you could give me an example of a social movement where you think there's complete unanimity. But I would channel Charles Tilley in saying is every social movement has important internal disagreements about what to achieve, how to achieve it, why it's important, et cetera. We might, if we were taking a little more time, we might whiteboard how the Black Lives Matter movement has a lot of shared goals, racial justice, eliminating or controlling misuse of power and force by police and so forth. We can kind of say what the shared goals are, but some people want to eliminate the police altogether. Others want to reform the police. Yet others want really just strict enforcement of the rights of security of Black people, brown people, yellow people, everyone. No hate crimes against Asian people, no police brutality against Black people. In other words, there can be a whole range of positions taken by people who are coming together into the movement of Black Lives Matter. And I think Tilly would say that is completely typical of social movements. Social movements involve that kind of disparity. But that brings us back to Jun Chao's point, that if we want to have sociological tools for understanding, medium-sized and large social movements, Gilbert's idea of we intentions is just not helpful, or at least I think you were kind of saying that. I certainly believe that that's true myself. There was one other point that, well, the Bratman idea, the interlocking personal intentions. Jun Chao, you asked the question, how does this relate to micro-foundations and actor-centered sociology? Bratman, clearly, he's building his theory. I have a lot of respect for Bratman. And by the way, what's really interesting is Bratman is actually interested in concrete problems of sociology and individual action. So in other words, he's not just an a priori philosopher. He's interested in explaining actual social coordination, social cooperation. So he's more kind of open to the idea that just theorizing about what social joint action is, just theorizing philosophically, that's not such a good approach. Rather, we should take some concrete problems of social cooperation and then see what kind of joint action, joint mentality, joint intentionality is needed in order to explain those forms of action. And I think Bratman would say, this overlapping, interlocking set of personal intentions and then subgroup intentions, that A, you can give very nice micro foundations for how that works, and B, it does a very good job of accounting for the actual behavior of contentious groups. Does that make sense to you, Jun Chao, in terms of your reading of Gilbert?
Yeah, that makes total sense. That's also my impression here. Bratman is very talks a lot. It's quite compatible with micro-foundation, and Gilbert wants to revive the tradition from Durkheim, but I do have now, although I'm a sociologist, I do appreciate Durkheim's emphasis of super individual. There are some super individual entities there, and I can appreciate there is something called social network, which is not only an aggregate of individuals, but I remain very cautious if we make the commitment, we restrict all the social facts into a relational entity and without any particular interest on individual. I think it's also very dangerous to do that. So.
Is this a good analogy, do you think? It's the house of cards analogy that I've referred to that James Coleman offers for social structures. But when you said, Jun Chao, you said Durkheim is putting his finger on the point that there are facts, social facts, which are more than just an aggregation of individual states of mind. Could we also say that a deck of cards has certain physical properties, and the properties of the little pyramid that we've constructed out of the cards, that structural stability is not just an aggregation. It's a little bit more than that. It's the physics of what's leaning on what. It's not mysterious. It's not like suddenly we're into abstract entities which are castles of cards, or abstract entities which are group intelligence, Durkheim. No, we don't need that. Even though we can affirm your point about networks, that a network of military officials in Burma, let's say, is, if they are connected by communication, they are very different from just a distributed group of officers around the country. And we can say why they're different, because they reinforce each other, they coordinate with each other, they're able to do things at appropriate times, which then lead to more effective collective action. So a network and a network of communication is adding something beyond the individual thought processes of the individuals. That's true, but it's not difficult to say what the micro foundations are. It's rather that these have been built out by individuals and they've been maintained by individuals, and then they coordinate the behavior of individuals. It kind of analogously to the cards have been built up, and now they have a property which the deck of cards doesn't have, namely can stand up 6 feet in the air and you can put a bunch of termites in it. I'm thinking of those lodges that termites build out in the desert. Beautiful things. Okay, any other comments about collective intentionality and the, well, actually the one other thing that Junchao, you said, which I think is completely correct, and maybe it's already self-evident, but it's very hard to see how you could go from the definitions which Gilbert gives at the level of 2, 3, or 4 individuals to 1,000 individuals. It's almost nonsensical to imagine we intentions for a group of 1,000 or even a group of 100. And therefore, again, you might say, it's therefore not very helpful in terms of doing sociology, doing dynamics of contention, the kind of empirical causal mechanisms work which McAdam, Tarrow, and Tilley do on uprisings and rebellions and so forth. Let me ask you a parenthesis, all of you, whether you take the same intellectual excitement in collective action, in popular politics and uprisings that they inspire in me. I'm not formulating this question too well, but there's something really interesting about revolutions and uprisings and the spread of protest. Black Lives Matter is very interesting, quite apart from its social justice implications. I find it very exciting to try, then to try to figure out what are the mechanisms through which kind of separated individuals who have their own mentality, their own needs, their jobs, their, tending to their garden. That's a French aphorism, one must tend one's own garden. What is it which allows a largish population to then come together in coordinated collective action, insurgency, uprising, rebellion, revolution, and so forth? That puzzle is why I asked you to read the parts of McAdam, Tarrow, Tilley, which I asked you to read early in the semester, because you could look at this as being the hardest and most common, broadest scope problem of sociology. Running a kingdom with a very powerful king, that's not a very interesting problem of sociology. If the king can just send out his troops and kill a bunch of people and make his will known, well then that's not very different from a gardener who tends his garden. But collective action, which is occurring in many places, which spreads from one village to another village, which involves people of different backgrounds, that question is a really hard question because it is collective and social. And Gilbert is offering one effort at how to account for it. Bratman, whom you didn't read, but she talks about Bratman, is offering a somewhat different approach. And I would say that Tilley, McAdam, and Tarrow are offering a third, and in my mind, a more credible view, because it's more realistic, really, about what we know about individual thinking, individual capacity for commitment, coordination, willingness to endure a certain amount of risk. Is it a natural thing for a person to be a hero who goes up against machine guns? Is that a natural human emotion? Probably not. Most of us, faced with the choice, oh, by the way, there's a squad of machine gunners out your front door. If you want to pick up your newspaper, you might want to sneak around the side. We would probably sneak around the side rather than just run into the machine guns. And yet, at various points in social movements, individuals are brought to have enough trust in other people, to have enough confidence in the potential success of an uprising. This is happening in Burma right now. To be willing to encounter deadly risk. And why do they do that? It's not that they're fundamentally different from us. It's that, you know, some set of social processes, political emotion processes have occurred, which lead to a capacity for mobilization and a capacity for collective resistance. Now I'm going to ask a question which anybody with 1 foot in Chinese politics may find awkward to answer, but why do you suppose the Chinese Communist Party is so attentive to the occurrence of labor strikes, environmental demonstrations, health groups of people with a certain disease? All of these groups are subject to censorship on social media. They're subject to police control when the state decides that they present a little bit of risk. Why do you suppose that is? People who suffer from, let's say, asthma, who are beginning to come together in Wuhan and Shanghai and 3 or 4 other cities, and they're coordinating through, what's the name of the social media platform in China that people try to use? Not WeChat.
Weibo.
Say it again.
Weibo.
Weibo. Yeah. Okay. So I'm asking you just to kind of picture an asthma group has kind of gotten going, and it's basically saying these local industrialists are killing us. They're putting a bunch of particulate pollution into the air. We're getting asthma. Our children are getting asthma. We must take action. We of Wuhan are coming together. How about you in Shanghai? Why don't you come together? Why would the Chinese state be so sensitive to a health-oriented collective action? What do you think? Any theories?
I can
Sorry,
provide
Dan, can
some.
you?
Yeah, you go first.
Yeah, say what you're going to say, Elun, and then I know Jun Chao has something to say too. Go ahead and say what you're going to say.
I was gonna clarify the question that you raised.
Okay. You mean, so what needs to be clarified? What are you thinking?
What's the question? What
Well,
are the actors?
The question is, I'm asking a question about the Chinese Communist Party, the central party, central political power in China, and its hypersensitivity to citizen organizations around issues that you might say are not political at all. Environmental protection, toxic waste spill, possibly environmental influences on diseases like asthma. The state is very conscious of individuals trying to organize themselves in a city, let alone across a number of cities, to say, we asthma victims, or we people whose children have been subject to, I don't know, lead in the water or whatever, Flint water crisis would be an American example. We have to come together. We need political power. Well, I'm giving it away when I say that, but we need protection. We need help. Why would an authoritarian state be very concerned about not just workers' unions, which may turn political, but any form of collective mobilization. Juan, I see you smiling a little bit. Do you have a little bit of an answer you'd like to give?
I think they are fear. It's because of fear. The government didn't want to any form of collective action. It's forbidden in China. You can't get together. Yeah,
exactly. That's exactly what I'm looking for. That any cause of collective action is regarded by the government as potentially enormous. It may begin small, but in a sense, the leaders of the Chinese Communist Party are maybe more attentive. I mean, for example, the Black Lives Matter movement would have been very threatening in China because people were coming together in very large numbers in American cities and challenging the police. And what Yuan is sharing is the idea of fear. And what is the fear? The fear is that not that 100,000 people all over the face of China will be protesting. That's not what the fear is. The fear is that 100,000 people will become 1 million people, which will become 10 million people. That collective action can spread very rapidly from one set of issues to another set of issues. And Tilly absolutely believes that that's true, and not specifically about China, but about France, about the occurrence of the French Revolution, about the occurrence of the 1848 revolution, the spread from one issue area to another issue area it creates an unpredictable politics, which would be threatening and worrisome to an authoritarian state. That's the idea, anyway, that I'm putting out there. And, well, I guess we could say, yes, well, 10 million people is small, but it's also, if you imagine 1 million people demonstrating in Shanghai for 100 days running, that's a serious threat.
Oh yeah, that would be really inconvenient as well, because it's already packed in the center of Shanghai, and an extra 1 million people would be, pretty horrible. It probably isn't right now, but when I lived in Shanghai, like, yeah, everywhere you go was just absolutely.
But I think the fear
rammed.
would be much greater than that. Why did the Egyptian authorities feel such fear and anger and hatred about Tahrir Square? And I think maybe 100,000 people in Tahrir Square day after day. Was it that they were leaving a lot of litter in the square? No, it was that they represented a potentially revolutionary force, that they had the potential of seriously assaulting the legitimacy of the Egyptian state. That's what's interesting about collective action.
Is some of this fear also about capacity building? So like one of the things I see, and maybe this comes from my lens as as someone interested in education and learning, is that collective action involves a repertoire of skills, right? That people build through collective action. They build through many people who work in large scale collective action started off, apprenticing in tiny kind of local campaigns, right? And so by coming down hard on anything, even if you think it's really a very long way from relevant, something that could be politicized, you're essentially de-skilling a population from and I say that it's more of a perception of de-skilling, because so many of these skills can be built for people through the engagements of technology these days in comparison to historically. But I think there's a kind of perception around the idea that people can build skills, and they can build coalitions, and they can build even tiny non-politicized networks. If things grew a little bit, they might draw on people who they've met through other kind of campaigns. So I think there's a kind of a real sense of, we could use the old adage, divide and conquer, but I think annihilating capacity is one of the things that I see as a reason why you would go hard on tiny organizations, or tiny collective incidents.
Following the earthquakes in Sichuan, I don't know, was it 10 years ago, these terrible earthquakes occurred and many school buildings collapsed and children were killed. There was in Sichuan a huge amount of public anger with the background suspicion that school construction had been very poor quality because of corruption. This was a very volatile potential area of protest in China. And I think, exactly as Jiwen said, I think there was a lot of official fear of what could happen in Sichuan if, if this protest movement got out of hand. I'm not exactly proposing we need to kind of apply these theories to China or to Egypt or to Poland directly, though what I do think is it's a useful antidote to reading, a philosopher like Gilbert, because the collective action that we know about, each of you in your own ways know about, if you have a history in Taiwan or China or Great Britain. Lucas, I'm sorry, you and I just have our history in Michigan to draw. But the importance of mobilization and resistance and collective action, this is a hugely important historical force. And if you're going to treat collective action seriously, it shouldn't be in an a priori way. I think that's actually what I'm putting forward. And I think, Junqiao, that was the undercurrent of your presentation about Gilbert. There's two a priori. It's two about logic and about criteria, and not enough about what are the concrete problems of explanation we would like to offer. So go ahead. Did you have something else you wanted to say?
Is that me? No, I'm typing in the chat.
Okay. Typing in the chat, I didn't even look.
Junqiao was just saying that collective action made by groups bigger than 7 people had to be approved by the police system on paper. And to save myself from typing it in the chat, I was just going to say that while this is not a collective action, it's just a short anecdote about police surveillance in China that I thought Junqiao might appreciate. One of my friends, when we were queuing for the expo, we were there in the year of the expo in Shanghai. We were queuing for the expo, and he'd put on a shirt that a t-shirt that he picked up while traveling in India, and he got pulled out of the queue by undercover, like the plainclothes police, and taken to a room and questioned, and they burnt his shirt in front of him. And it was only later he figured out that it had a Tibetan flag in the corner, because he'd picked it up while traveling. And they gave him like something else to wear, I can't remember, and sent him back out. I guess, being like a white tourist, you don't get quite so much. I don't know, you do get treated differently, or I felt like I was treated differently in many places. But yes, and then they followed him around as he walked around the expo for the rest of the day. He's actually someone who worked in China on a regular basis. He was really worried about his visa being pulled long term, but it didn't materialize. They just burnt his shirt in front of him, which I imagine was probably quite intimidating. Anyway, anecdote over.
Yeah. Well, it's I guess what it underlines to me is that the theory of contentious politics, it's a comment which McAdam made in the interview I did with him, because I asked him, it kind of seems that you think contentious politics is not a small part of sociology, it's an enormous part of sociology. And he said, yes, I think contentious action, collective action, mobilization, alliances, that this is key to huge swaths, huge parts of the social world. And we really need to pay a lot of attention to the processes, the aggregation processes, the dynamics, the causal mechanisms associated with collective action and contentious politics, which is, of course, exactly what they try to do in that book, The Dynamics of Contention. Okay, let's segue to Yilun. Let's see what Yilun has to say here. In Taiwan, people have to notify the authorities before having a demonstration. Not as difficult as it used to be, but clearly authoritarian legacy. Yeah, interesting. Okay, so Ilun, do you have do you want to use the slides? I've given you the screen.
Yeah, I'm trying to like go over like uploading the. I have a Word document instead of a slideshow.
It's fine.
So I'm going to upload in a Google Doc so that everyone can
Great.
view it. Yeah, the piece that I'm going to present today is it's written by Dan, and in 1998, or if my memory serves well, about the title is the title is Marxism and Popular Politics, the micro foundations of class conflict. And so in this piece, the idea is to sort of from the Marxist camp, how can we improve the theory of Marxism to better explain popular politics. Sorry, I need to okay, I hope that works. I just post it in a chat.
Okay, I'm going to try to open that. Yeah, that opened.
And so the background, I'm going to present primarily the background and the argument, and then we'll move into the discussion part. And so like as this piece argued that Marxism hold the exploited, it's a class-based argument that exploited class will have their own assessment of their class interest before taking an action, taking a collective action to secure their interest. But as Dan argued in this piece, that kind of theoretical argument is too sweeping, and it's different from what we have seen in the real world. You can't just discern some micro level phenomenon, or say people are being exploited and it's a universal thing, and one day or suddenly people will realize that their interests are being violated or like undermined, so they take an action. So as the critique shows, we need some other basis to explain popular politics, and so as Dan argues here, that we need to find some micro foundation to improve the theories. And the first thing that came up to me is one of the first article that we read in this semester, that in also Dan's book, New Direction in the Philosophy of Social Sciences, that Dan used example from Chun Guangli's book, published in 2007, about Chinese protests of Chinese workers in the south and in the north, in Liaoning and I think Guangdong. Why there are there are some critical variation in workers in different places, even in China. So then emphasize that the book has free important strengths in by accounting for the contingency, variation, and internal heterogeneities in social processes. So I feel like the praise for that book is similar to what this article that we are reading is trying to do, is trying to find more like variation, internal heterogeneity when we want to explain workers' protests or social protests in general in social sciences. So so here's the first theoretical argument I find important in Dan's argument, is that the higher generalizations or regularities that we find should be grounded in an account of causal mechanisms that produce them one or more levels down in the direction of individual activity. I feel like this is also the goal of this course, is trying to convey. And also it reminds me of the question that Dan raised 2 weeks ago: how can we make sense of structuralism? If we want to believe in like a micro level social process, how can we make sense of that by extending to more micro social processes? And so the other argument, another argument that Dane makes here, is that we should abandon the idea of class politics, in the sense that popular mobilization emerged spontaneously once some macro levels conditions are realized, are ripe. Let's say the classic argument by Marx that he merely look at workers, industrial workers, or like say capitalism is a necessary stage moving toward socialism, communism. That kind of macro level focus couldn't offer us better explanations for popular politics. So this article shows that we need to look at we shouldn't assume that workers, or say wage earners, are as a whole and they are all the same, they are homogeneous. A good Marxist approach to popular politics should examine variations in terms of geographical locations, occupation, social cleavage, and so on and so forth. And so we can say that local processes and like individual group identity formation is important. Are required here. And also there are like two main dimension that then wants us to look at. One is more like a cultural stuff, including political motivations, political cultures, and the other is more like organizational and leadership side. And so here's in terms of political motivation and political culture, I wrote here that the aggregation of individual rationality is important here, because for traditional Marxists, he or she would argue that mostly he would argue that a beginner analysis with class interest. But here Dan is proposing proposing an alternative to reconceptualize class interest, or like to reconceptualize individual rationality. Because if you from place A to place B, or from different in different cases, we will find like class interest is refers to different things. And also political cultures, it could be like local religious belief, kingship loyalties, moral and political commitments, ideology. And I feel like in contemporary context, it is also refers to like some historical legacy of let's say workers movements. If a for instance, if we want to study a factory's protest, we might look at like maybe 10 or 20 years ago whether there's any similar experience emerge from that factories, and whether that kind of experience shape today's protest or today's inaction. And the other part of the argument that Dan think a Marxist approach to popular politics should look at is organizations and leadership. Although he reiterates that a purely organization or a purely material argument cannot work without a fairly specific kind of moral values, or like a fairly specific kind of political cultures where the material conflicts emerged. And so for leadership and organizations, that then argues that leaderships and organization are among micro mechanisms that underlie popular politics. It's interesting that for me that they make such an argument, because it is widely assumed in sociology that organizations are some kind of organizational network are meso level mechanism. So yeah, this could be one of the questions I want to raise. How do we, I'll write below that, how do we make that categorization? How do we distinct from like meso and micro mechanism, or yeah, here. And so for then leadership or like organization are critical, because you can't imagine popular mobilization without them. And it is certainly important when we want to like effectively mobilize people and coordinate a large amount of people doing some like different activities. And also to, I think this one is fairly critical, how to, because we know like at times like some spontaneous protests appeared in, but how can we like avoid the movement or like some kind of political cause being override by those spontaneous protests, and how to overcome the what then called like inherent localism of spontaneous protest. So to wrap up, that we know that Dan is claiming that previously or traditional Marxist approach ignore political culture and individual motivations, political motivation, and also leadership and organizations. And that's the micro foundations that can help us to improve the traditional Marxist approach. And so here's other question that I want to discuss with folks. The first one is related to another piece we are gonna discuss today, I think, is like Dan assumed that organizations to be important and a role that has a positive effect for popular mobilization. But for Vaughan, organization can have some systemic negative effect on people's behavior. So how should we re-examine the role of organizations in popular politics? That's the first one. And the second one is I'm curious about why like organizations and leadership have been downplayed by Marxists, even if Lenin raised their importance in his actions and like his own writings. And the last one is the one that I have addressed during the presentation, is that how should we distinguish meso level explanation and micro mechanism or micro level foundations that Dan is trying to convey here? Yeah, I guess that's it.
Great. Thank you, Loon. It's a very nice presentation and really good questions. So this whole idea of whether Marxism has a viable, sociologically defensible theory of political mobilization, that's kind of the question. Is classical Marxism, or does classical Marxism have a viable theory of political mobilization? And in one sense, we would say it certainly has a theory. And the theory is expressed in the Communist Manifesto. It is the idea that, well, it's the last sentence of the Communist Manifesto: workers of the world unite, you have nothing to lose but your chains. So there's the idea that the economic structure of capitalism at the national level and eventually at the global level is inherently biased against the interests of workers. And then what Marx and Engels are saying is workers are intelligent. They will come to recognize the disadvantage which they have within the system of property relations of capitalism. They will then see that even though there are many salient ways in which they might be grouped together, the most salient, the most important is their class identity. That's the theory which Marx puts forward. Was it based on China? No. Marx had a little bit of knowledge about China. He actually wrote a little bit about the Taiping Rebellion in the 1860s. So he was kind of interested in China, but he knew almost nothing about China. He had no knowledge about China. What he was writing about was England, and to a limited extent, Germany and France. And he had the view that the class cleavages, which Engels characterized in the 1830s in the conditions of the working class in England, that those class cleavages are increasingly transparent and clear, with the result that workers become increasingly focused on their class location rather than their religious conflict. He doesn't talk about race much, so he's not interested in the question that we have to be really interested in contemporary capitalism, and that is the role that racial identities or ethnic identities play in political mobilization. But instead, he takes the view that workers will come to recognize their position within the class system, the property system. They will not be deceived by the ideology of opportunity, and they will come to band together in support of their material interests. That's the crude theory of Marxist political mobilization, or motivation and mobilization. What I'm trying to do in this article is to get way more granular and to say that's a very general theory. So let's think about it in application to China in the 19th century and in the 20th century. In the 19th century, it's very interesting. There were huge peasant rebellions in China, in different parts of China. And very rarely did they take the form of class-based rebellions. Much more commonly, they were rural versus urban, or region versus region, or religion, millenarian rebellions, which had to do with rural Buddhism, basically. Rarely did class and property play a central role in mobilization. But more generically, the people that I studied anyway, who did sociology and kind of political sociology of China in the 19th century and then into the 20th century, came to see that political identities in different parts of China were shaped by many factors, and landlord tenant, property owner, that was just one part of the political identity formation. So in other words, the first empirical observation that I offered in this article is we're not explaining Chinese politics very well in the 19th century if we only pay attention to position in the class system. Instead, the kind of factors like kinship networks and religion and location, geographical location, these kind of factors, village against village, conflicts over water, conflicts over control of natural resources in the region. Those kinds of conflicts were more salient at the local level than the features of the property system and the class system. That's kind of the central observation of this article. So what I'm basically suggesting is the importance of offering a more granular analysis of the ways in which political identity emerges in a particular location. There's a French political scientist, basically, who studied 19th century rebellions in a lot of detail. His name is Lucien Bianco. I'm going to write his name in here. I think I probably referred to him in the article, I don't remember. But Lucien Bianco studied many instances of peasant rebellions and uprisings in China in the 19th century. And he had one central conclusion. It is that all of those rebellions were local rebellions. They had, with the exception of the Taiping rebellion, the peasant rebellions of the 19th century had almost no capacity to go beyond the local confines of what the issues were at the locality level, the village and town level. And Bianco also wrote a book about the Chinese Revolution. And his view was the grievances which existed in the 20th century were very similar to those that existed in the 19th century. But what Bianco believes is the salient difference, why Chinese communism became a powerful revolutionary force, is exactly the factor that Yilun emphasized. It's the factor of organization. It's the factor of the creation of an effective Chinese Communist Party. And why would that be important? Well, it's important for a reason that we now have some exposure to through McAdam, Tarrow, and Tilley. And that is the idea of kind of escalation and coordination of conflict over a larger terrain. So Bianco's view is that local peasants may be very angry at their own local landlords, and they may burn the hut or the house or the property of the local landlord, but they're not, that uprising is not likely to extend to the next village 20 kilometers away without some organizational basis, some way of mobilizing so that the villagers in one village, well, the villagers in villages all over the region are brought to see we've got a shared ideology and a shared set of interests. That was the role of the Chinese Communist Party. That's the idea. And he, Lucien Bianco, argues that the Republicans, the Kuomintang, also had an ideology, but they were not organizationally very effective in conveying that ideology at the local level. They were more of an elite party, but not very able to convey their presence. They did not have cadres at the village level. Emily, were you about to say something? So the upshot is what I'm kind of suggesting, and I think at the point that I wrote this article in 1989, I don't think Tilley was, for me, I think I'd read his work on the French Revolution, but I didn't know much more about Tilley than his writings, the repertoire of contention, basically, about French revolutionary activity. But I was kind of feeling my way towards something that's rather similar to what we find in dynamics of contention. And it is that contentious politics is a dynamic process involving multiple different sources of grievance and mobilization and coordination. And the task of the historical sociologist is to kind of discover how it is that in one village, lineage becomes the salient political dimension, and in another village, landlord-tenant relations become the salient. What leads one area to go for culture and another area to go for class and property? And Marx seems to believe that that's an inevitable choice. Class will inevitably become the salient issue. Whereas what historical sociology seems to tell us is, no, it takes deliberate effort on the part of a party. It might be the Kuomintang, it might be the Communist Party of China, it might be the Progressive Labor Party in Chicago, Illinois, but some organized effort must be made to have local cadres and a local ability to mobilize and get people excited and get them willing to coordinate their actions. Become, what we were seeing in Jun Chao's presentation, become more of a collective entity rather than just a bunch of. I wonder if any of you are familiar with what Marx said about peasants in I think it's in the 18th Brumaire, it might be the class struggles in France. He wrote some political writings in the 1850s. 1850s, I think, about France, which were very dismissive of peasants. And he writes that peasants are simply a sack of potatoes. They have no revolutionary capacity at all. And that's why they then supported the popular election of Napoleon III. He also has a really funny thing to say about Napoleon III. History repeats itself. The first time is tragedy, the second time is farce. It's a very funny story. Napoleon is the tragedy, Napoleon III is the farce. But in any case, his idea that rural people would be revolutionary, he thinks rural people have no political consciousness at all. They are a sack of potatoes. Whereas what kind of revolution was the Chinese Revolution? It was a rural revolution. A few of you know that it didn't start out a rural revolution, right? Anybody want to fill in that story at, one or two sentences? Where did the Chinese Communist Party start?
I think it's in Wuchang or something like close to Wuhan. So it's like the Chinese Communist Party. At first, they tried to. The party was established by intellectuals who want to emulate Russian Communist Party. So they try the same strategy, and they try to mobilize urban workers in China, and which is not very effective since China has not entered that level of industrialization. And after, I think it's Mao come to power, the party changes its strategy from like mobilizing in urban China to mobilizing the rural. And like what they call 农村包围城市, like surrounding the urban area using the rural area.
And in fact, there was the very first Communist Party location was in Shanghai. I have a picture of it here, but I won't try to locate it since I have about 1,000 pictures of Shanghai. It's one of 1,000. But the very first location for a Communist Party unit was in Shanghai. And the strategy was an urban-based industrial worker strategy. But then there was, I've forgotten in what year, but it was in the 1930s, there was a sudden lightning stroke by the Kuomintang, by the nationalist government against the communists, leading to, yeah, you're right, Yilun, tiny number of people there. It's a very small building. There was a massacre of, revolutionary workers, which basically permanently ended the possibility of communist struggle in the cities in China. So the choice of going to the countryside and becoming a peasant-based revolutionary movement was kind of forced on the Chinese Communist Party and Chairman Mao. And the Long March was not designed as a heroic demonstration of the courage and tenacity of the Communist Party. It was a pretty harsh reality that they were fighting battles twice a day for months on end, and it was kind of a bloodbath. But they survived, and they then built out, but with a new strategy. They built out into base areas. I think there were, I don't know, 7 or 8 base areas in different remote parts of China, and they built out a structure of cadres who penetrated to the village level. In other words, the organization became a very strongly represented organization at the local level. And it began to develop fairly unified messages. Though one of the things I find interesting in reading about the history of the Chinese Revolution is that different base areas, their commanders developed somewhat different ideological messages. So it's kind of interesting to compare the ideological messages in 2 or 3 different base areas, with class conflict being way more overt in some areas than other areas. Anyway, the point here is really just a very simple one. It is that from a philosophy of social science point of view, from a philosophy of history point of view, and from the point of view of historical sociology, we don't get very far by taking the Communist Manifesto and then trying to fold the history of China, or for that matter, the history of France, into the mold of class conflict and revolutionary struggle by workers. That effort is not a very successful effort. More successful is a more granular approach, which simply recognizes, exactly as Yilun emphasized, recognizes that in different regions, different areas, different villages, different towns, there are different causes of mobilization. There are different kind of almost stochastic, almost random influences on political identity, leading to very different cleavages in society, and very different kinds of political and social uprisings. So it's really kind of the article is kind of a demand for a more granular treatment of politics. It doesn't suggest, Yilun, you were kind of generous in saying it's asking for a better Marxism. I think really what the article is asking for is a better theory of collective and contentious politics, of which Marxism, kind of Marxist theory of class interest, can be one part, but only one part. And could I bring us up to the present a little bit? It's not quite to the present, but what's interesting about the US labor movement is that it became a bread and butter. I think did I call it a meat and potatoes movement a little while ago? That wasn't correct. Bread and butter, I think, is the phrase that's used for the US labor movement. But from the 1930s forward, the US labor movement kind of gave up on social issues and Marxist style, communist style demands, and focused on material well-being, kind of terms of contract, labor conditions, and wages for workers. And the great labor leaders of the 1930s were making a very deliberate strategic choice. And then they were interested in generating large-scale support. There's an image, the image that I associate with the course actually converges directly with tonight's discussion. I don't know if you've noticed it on Canvas, but it's called the Battle of the Overpass. The Battle of the Overpass. It's the Ford Motor Company's. What's the name of the plant? It's the oldest, well, not the oldest, but the largest plant from the 1920s and 30s, downriver from Dearborn, Michigan. At its height, 50,000 workers worked there. And the very early formation of the United Auto Workers tried to unionize that plant. And there was a lot of violence because the Ford Motor Company hired professional thugs, basically. And so there were a lot of beatings at the plant when workers would demonstrate. And on the photograph that is on Canvas, is a photograph of the meeting of several labor leaders. And it turned out to be a very powerful mobilizational tool, because the labor leaders came away just bloodied, and it created outrage among workers. So rather than discouraging the movement, is this an interesting finding for Polish leaders in 1980, or possibly for Burmese leaders today? Do a lot of violence to protesters. That'll be great. You'll really frighten them. Well, that's one possibility. Or that won't be so great. You'll really anger them, and the next protest will be 10 times as large. The UAW took a big surge forward as a result of the violence associated with the Battle of the Overpass. Walter Reuther is the leader who is in the center of that photograph. And I find it a very interesting history. But here's the one other thing I want to mention before we move on to organizations. I think I mentioned to you that Chuck Tilley, provided a commencement address at Dearborn. And we have two ceremonies in Dearborn, morning and afternoon. In the afternoon ceremony, I had invited a labor leader, Mark Gaffney, who was then the president of Michigan AFL-CIO. And I think I mentioned last time, but it's too good not to mention it again. These two men at the luncheon were seated together between the two commencements, and they talked mobilization. So one was a lifelong organizer, labor organizer, and a very, very smart man. Do you know how smart he was? He was a Teamster who had been a philosophy student at Michigan State University. Really smart guy. I really like Mark Gaffney. And Tilley, of course, lifelong student of popular politics, contentious politics. They had the most interesting conversation about the development of the UAW and something called the drum movement, the Dodge Revolutionary Union movement, which was in the 1960s, 66, 67, 68, of Black workers at Ford plants, well, actually at all big four auto plants. May I ask you the interesting question? Did Black workers have different interests than white workers, do you think, in the auto industry? What's your quick answer to that? Lucas, what do you think? You grew up in Michigan. Black workers and white workers have exactly the same interests in the auto industry?
I would assume not, but as to any good reasons I might have, the only the thing I would immediately think of is just the massive wealth disparity in Detroit, and with Detroit being the place sort of known for the auto industry, I'd have to imagine it has to do something with that, but any more I can't give you.
Okay, so you might speculate a little bit. What kind of jobs did Black workers get in the Rouge plant? The Rouge plant is the big plant on the Rouge River. What kind of jobs did Black workers get? Answer, they got the worst jobs, the most dangerous jobs, the hottest jobs in the foundry. You might ask the question, what positions of leadership did Black workers have in the emerging UAW? And again, the answer is none. They had no political influence. So the drum movement was a very exciting, it's really exciting to study. And I kind of imagined that Tilley would never have heard of it. It actually turned out he was very expert about the Dodge Revolutionary Union movement. And so the conversation, well, what's the relevance to Elun's presentation? The relevance is white workers and Black workers in the 1940s and 50s had very different interests. Race, rather than class position, had more salience. Black workers were more exploited, more oppressed by their racial status than their status as wage laborers. How does that fit with Marxism? Well, Marxism has a very hard time with race. The most that Marxist sociologists are able to say is race is a card that the owners use to divide the working class. So if they can create contention between white and Black workers, brown and Black workers, et cetera, then that's good for their interests. But that's not a very astute sociological theory, I don't think. Yeah, go ahead, Lucas.
I'm curious as to why it seems like Marx would leave out such a large disparity. I mean, it doesn't seem like race relations are anything new in that came out of the 20th century. I suppose they may have definitely been exacerbated, but it seems that race relations definitely would have been within Marx's timeline, within his framework.
So he knew
Yeah, I mean,
almost
sorry,
nothing about the US is the problem. Yeah, go
yeah,
ahead.
that's the
Emily.
thing. I was going to say, you know, when we think about like these days, lots of his empirical work was in the, or not empirical work, but lots of the empirical work they drew on really was from the UK. And we have to remember that the UK was very, very, very white until the, you know, the mid 19th century when the you know, the collapse of the empire led to, you know, mass immigration, people settling in what they considered their mother country, right? So so what Britain, despite the fact that Britain had interacted with kind of racialized peoples for a very long time, it wasn't visible in the UK in the same way as it has been in the US for the last 400 years. It's just a very, very different kind of construct.
And you might say actually that the corresponding conflict was between English workers and Irish workers.
Yeah, which was very prominent and not, you know, and not racialized in the same way. And in, you know, in many ways, we might say that at that point in British history, the people of color that you met, you know, in the UK were likely to be high status individuals rather than low status individuals, because you're talking about the time of empire, right? So you would have visiting maharajas, you know, but they were high status individuals rather than low status individuals. So I think that's part of the issue. You know, Europe was, I think still European sociology talks about class more than race, and that's one of the reasons why I think that you know, so as Dan will know, like I work quite a lot with Bourdieu's concepts, and you know, they really work well in a class system, and they're used very frequently by European education scholars really effectively. And I think people have had to do more work with them in an American context because race has to be. I don't think it's impossible to kind of add to the framework, and Bourdieu is more recent, so he does talk about it. But class is what people consider to be kind of primary in Europe. Sorry, just on this, I think I've said before in this class that when you actually like survey American people, like 85% of American people consider themselves middle class. So whereas people don't answer that way in Europe, they have very strong. They tend to have very strong and hereditary class identities in a different way. So I think there are lots of kind of cultural reasons why Marx would talk about class and not talk about race in the same way.
So I'm putting up this photo. This is from the drum period, but it was at Ford, not at Dodge. But this is a photograph that was taken of a black worker. It's a very, I find it a majestic photograph. I don't know what it inspires in you. But to me, it inspires Black pride. It inspires strong Black worker. It inspires the idea, you know, really of Black militant demand for equality in the workplace. And that was the demand of the From movement and the Drum movement. And what's interesting about that, you know, from the point of Eloon's presentation, for example, is that you know, it's just a good, clear example of a different ground of salience for political mobilization. White workers and Black workers did share economic circumstances, but there was a huge amount of racism among white workers, and Black workers really had an interest in protecting themselves and, you know, gaining equal treatment in factories and equal treatment in the union. One of the people who was a major leader, I had the privilege of meeting this man, his name was General Baker. That was his name. And in probably 15 or 16, I taught a course on the history of the civil rights movement, and I invited General Baker, who had been an activist during the Ford effort to transform the UAW in such a way that it was racially open and equal. And General Baker came and talked about that time. So it was a real privilege. He has since passed away. Lucas, you were going to make a comment.
Yeah, it was essentially, I just finished actually typing it in the chat, but I was wondering, it doesn't seem like racism is necessarily something that came out of the 19th century, but maybe I'm wrong. It seems like, I mean, reading people like Shakespeare, it seems clear that there have always been sort of concepts of racism and distinguishing of groups. And so I'm wondering maybe, yeah, I guess you're saying US racism is very distinctive. And so are you construing then race relations as we know it today in the US, and then I guess across the whole world stems from American race relations?
I'm going to give you two quotes.
I think they're very influential. Like that's one thing I would say. I think that the debate about race in the US in the last 15 years has really influenced how people talk about race relations across the world. And they've really changed how people talk about race and racism in the UK. I know that people talk about race very differently and have over the last 15 years, particularly as technology has enabled much more kind of cross-cultural discussion. And I really, there have been people of color in the UK since the early Roman period, right? So I'm not saying that there were just no people of color in the UK. That's not what I mean at all. I just mean that there wasn't a large significant population which were all oppressed in a particular way, and so characterizing and understanding the particular oppression of that group was just not easy at the point when Marx was writing. I think that's kind of what I mean. So yeah, there may well have been particular groups in particular places, but not with the same kind of overarching racialized framework that you see in the US, which is very particular. I don't know if that's helpful.
What I'm kind of getting at here, when I refer to Du Bois and Stokely Carmichael and, the 1960s racial justice movement, but also to slavery, Reconstruction, Jim Crow movement, segregation, racial discrimination. I don't want to disagree with you, Lucas, that there is racial and, kind of skin and pigment-based, national origin-based discrimination throughout the world. That I think that is true. US racism seems sui generis. It seems to be its own sociological category. Because of practices and beliefs which have been embedded for generations in our society. It's not just an expression of general human propensity for racism. I'm offering this as a theory. It's not a moral theory, by the way, though I think it has moral implications. It's a sociological theory that Du Bois is completely right, that the hardest problem America has ever faced, ever will face, is getting rid of the racism that came with slavery. And unions in a sense are based on the equality of working men and women, and yet unions were racist places in the 1940s, 50s, even into the 60s. Universities are said to be places of equality for everyone, and yet students of color in American universities, I think pretty commonly have the view, we're not treated the same, we are treated differently. So the upshot I'm getting at, I'm sorry, I don't mean to distract the line of thought here, but American racism seems like a very distinctive kind of racism with its own history and a persistence which goes beyond comprehension, really. At the time that Barack Obama was elected president, there were, news commentators saying, hey, good news, racism is over. We have a Black president. And we've had the greatest resurgence or rise of white supremacy in this country during the Obama presidency and after the Obama presidency that we've probably seen in 100 years. So it's kind of clear that American racism is alive and well. So somehow we burned right into the break period. So why don't we break now, and we'll come back together at 8 p.m. refreshed and happy and eager to talk. Okay, see you in just a couple minutes. Yilun, thank you for that presentation. It was a nice presentation.
No. I should have done that earlier. Yeah, I really like that I like the piece. Yeah. I feel like I academically, intellectually, I really like Chuck Tilley and his work, but I don't really like the agenda of contentious politics that they have been working on since early 21st century.
Interesting.
Yeah, and I find that the way that they conceptualize the process, it's I don't find that very productive. But the way that you propose for like contentious agenda of contentious politics or popular politics or Marxist, it's a different strategy of conceptualization, and but I feel like that's a good start, or I more appreciated that one than.
Great. Well, thank you. It was good presentation, and I'm glad to have the written version of it too. So Emily, I think it's smarter for us to go to you and your presentation of Diane Vaughan. And as time permits, I'll do a little bit of presentation of social ontology of government. But I don't want to run out of time. It would be very ironic if we ran out of time on Junqiao last week and on you this week. So why don't you, I'll give you the floor.
I think running out of time is not going to be the big concern here. For context for everybody else, because I knew there were a lot of presentations this week, I did email down and I said, should I just do something really short? Because I know I've given both of the presentations I've given so far this semester have been fairly long, I think, when I look back at them. So Junqiao is smiling, and so is Yilun. So I think that's probably true. Teachers can always talk, you see, that's the problem. So I thought what I would do is do a very teachery thing and try and summarize the whole thing in one simple diagram. So if I were teaching this paper, I would have a diagram like this. So, I'm treating you all like you're 16. That's not why you laughed. Okay. Right. So let me do the share screen thing. There we go. And I'll make it bigger. Excellent. So here is
Emily, before you start,
yeah.
for a diagram, I require arrows connecting point to every other point. But
in fairness, this is probably the least colorful diagram I've produced for this semester. Usually I'm big on colors and things, but basically what I thought was interesting about this paper is that the first half kind of lays out a set of theoretical ideas which are related to various ways of conceptualizing I can't see the top of my screen, so various ways of thinking about whatever it is at the top.
Theoretical perspectives and routine nonconformity.
That's the one, routine nonconformity. That's the bit I can't see. So various theoretical perspectives that potentially help or have toolkits that can explain issues of routine nonconformity. So within a kind of environmental perspective, people can talk from a power relations perspective. The new institutionalists have toolkits for explaining how environment can lead to nonconformity. the Granovetter perspective, which Vaughan talks about as economic embeddedness, also has a toolkit which can potentially explain nonconformity. And she does the same thing for organizational characteristics and 3 aspects of organizational characteristics, picks up on kind of theoretical constructs, which kind of just makes space for this potential idea of routine nonconformity. So I won't go through all of them. There are a whole range of them, and I've listed them down here for you to see. I made the titles of them really short so that they fitted on my single slide. And then what she does is she takes this kind of set of categories of environment, organizational characteristics, cognition and choice, and then overlays that against 3 particular kinds of nonconformity, mistake, misconduct, and disaster, and has a look at literature which, or empirical, generally empirical literature, which tries to understand each of those areas from a particular perspective. And so kind of what comes out is that we get these sort of patterns of kinds of nonconformity which tend to be studied in the context of environment or structure or task, and areas where there isn't really a kind of link being made at the moment. So for example, between mistake and the environment or the regulatory environment, or misconduct and the actual tasks that are being carried out. So there are these kind of areas that that she conceives as poorly understood by doing that. But then just even given that, one of the things that she really calls out is that while there's some empirical work spotting in this table in various places, that the theories which can account for this nonconformism are not being very, very richly drawn on and used, so that even when we see kind of discussions about complexity in disaster, for example, that there isn't a lot of strong discussion which draws on ideas about myth and ceremony or embeddedness or, I mean, complexity, yes, but or structural secrecy, that these ideas, these theoretical frameworks are not being taken up coherently or consistently or richly enough at the moment. So I think the main thing I drew from this was that it was a really interesting way to think about a field and think about how we might conceptualize beginning to work in a field. I thought it was quite a useful exercise for us as PhD students, sorry Lucas, as we're sort of shaping our research agenda, but for you as you're writing your applications for grad school, you might want to do a kind of process like this where you think about some theory in some areas and this kind of mapping process. I thought it was actually a kind of a useful strategy for getting to grips with the field. It's certainly something that is the kind of task I would set for students. You know, it's like a pedagogical process. If I want you to look at the theory and then I want you to look at some cases and see how well they map together. And I'd be interested to know from that perspective whether or not they drew a diagram like this when they were mapping these things out, because when I read it, I instantly saw a diagram, a table with things in boxes. So I'd be interested to know that. But anyway, this is my brief summary of the field of the paper.
And the red comments, basically you're offering criticism in the red comments.
Well, these aren't criticisms that I pull up really. So some of them come up in their conclusion, and some come up when I was reading through each of the sections. When I read this through for the second time to make my table, they were places where, you know, so for example, in the environment section in mistake, I think it's a mistake. They sort of say, well, you know, this is really not discussed, but sometimes they talk about the criminal justice system like this, you know. So these were in particular places where there was a comment that this is kind of poorly understood, or no one's really looked at complexity yet, or yeah, or there was just nothing in the paragraph apart from, apart from we don't really know anything so far. So yeah, this was a kind of field, I saw this as a very kind of like field orienting sort of activity, right, this paper, and I'm sure it took much effort to write and orient, because the depth of fields, the kind of depth of theoretical perspectives being discussed is vast, right? But I thought it was a really interesting kind of exercise to think about doing as we're all thinking about writing scholarly papers. Right, I'll stop sharing.
So that's it's really valuable. Thank you, Emily. It's really cool analysis of what the structure of her presentation is. I don't know if you mentioned the date, but it's 1999. So that's 22 years ago that this article was written. And it turns out that a lot of work has been done since then. So it's, in a way, it's kind of a, I don't know, it's a little bit of an anachronism for me to ask you to read it, except that I did want you to have something that is focusing specifically on dysfunction. And I think she does a very nice job of highlighting the fact that dysfunction and error and catastrophe, these are not unpredictable, crazy, wow, how'd that happen kind of events. Bhopal, for example, the terrible chemical disaster in India where thousands of people were killed or injured. And the investigation showed that corporate failures, organizational failures, but also Indian state regulatory failures were the cause of this chemical disaster. And it's only one of numerous chemical disasters in India. So the reason why it's valuable to read Diane Vaughan, I think I did mention in the chat that her really famous book is on the Space Shuttle Challenger disaster. I think it's called the Challenger disaster. And it's what she's trying to understand is what the organizational causes primarily at NASA were, which led to the loss of the flight, the loss of I guess it was 7 astronauts, the catastrophe for the American space program, the tragedy of that loss of life. What were the organizational causes which led to that? Well, she is one of the important contributors to that discussion. What's interesting, though, is that she's only one of the main contributors. She refers to Charles Perrow, who wrote a book called Normal Accidents, who is also a major contributor. But what's really interesting to me is if you were writing that review article today, there would be a much bigger and in a sense, more filled out literature on organizational failure.
So it would have taken longer to write. So we should be writing these for research that is much more.
Well, I'm wondering if it would take longer to write, or if we were workshopping her article, we might say, you spent a lot more time on certain issues than you needed to, and not because of your own fault. In only 10 years, there would be some really important stuff on high reliability organizations that you can't even comment on because, basically that literature didn't exist at the time. So anybody have any comments or observations you'd like to make about Vaughan or Emily's table, diagram, autopsy? Okay, so I'm going to share my screen. I'm taking silence to mean let's get to this part of the presentation. But I think that's not the one I need. This is the one I need. Yeah, good. Okay, so what I want to do in the last couple minutes, really, of the course, always a poignant feeling of so many things to discuss, so little time left to discuss them. But it's actually kind of appropriate that the very final reading that you're doing is just a couple of chapters from the book, very short book, which I wrote called A New Social Ontology of Government. And this is of interest to you. It's of interest to our course for a very concrete and practical reason. The practical reason is that this book is an exercise in applied philosophy of social science. I'm of the opinion that political scientists, sociologists, and organizational theorists, and people who comment on the workings of government and the workings of corporations, that in some ways their research and their conceptual apparatus is hampered by the fact that they do not have a more specific and a better understanding of social ontology, and in particular of an actor-centered social ontology. So the key question which I'm posing in this book is how does government work? What is government? And why does government often work less well than we would hope and expect? In a way, it's what Tocqueville or Hobbes or John Locke might have wanted to write, except their examples of government were very primitive examples of government compared to the Environmental Protection Agency or the various agencies of the American government or the British or the French government. Government is a much more complex organizational complex. It's a complex of organizations, and its functioning needs to be understood with a good, clear idea of what kind of ontological assumptions we can make about government and about large organizations. So I pulled out just a couple of quotes from the reading that I asked you to do. Here's the first one. This is taken from the first chapter. It is plain that any specific government is not a unitary thing. Instead, it is a composite thing that encompasses many social functions, networks, doings, and powers at multiple and overlapping levels. Government is not precisely layered in the fashion suggested by the organizational chart. If you go to the National Security Agency or the CIA or the Department of Justice, you can pull down their organizational chart, and it looks very tidy and very logical and very well organized. But what I'm suggesting here is that that is actually not a good indication of how these government agencies actually work. Instead, the government or government agencies consist of multiple, that's the important operative word here, multiple systems, organizations, groups, specialists, brokers, and rogues. Does that surprise you, that word rogue here? What is suggested to you by my including rogues along with the group, specialists, brokers, systems, and organizations? Well, think about that for a minute. I'll finish the sentence. All of these different things working sometimes with considerable independence and sometimes with great coordination and subordination. I guess that's 3 sentences, but it's got a lot of content. And in a way, it really captures the task which I set myself in writing this book. It is to have a new vocabulary, a new framework for thinking about government. But of course, government, as it says, is not one unitary thing. The US government says this or that. Well, that's just that's a grammatical misunderstanding. The US government is multiple things. And so if it's about, voting laws, then it's not the US government as a whole, it's the Department of Justice. It's one agency within US government with some loose degree of coordination with other departments and with the executive branch. But as you begin to think about what you read in the Washington Post or the New York Times about government action, you begin to see, I think, the realism of this quotation. that government is indeed, it consists of multiple super large organizations. The Department of Justice is gigantic. The Department of the Environmental Protection Agency is gigantic. The State Department is gigantic. And so what I just said about government is also true of the State Department. And so I'll say it again. The State Department is not one unitary thing. Instead, it is a composite thing that encompasses many social functionings, et cetera, all the way down to the rogues. Why do you think I included the rogues part, by the way? What is a rogue? Yeah, Lucas.
I don't know that I have a exact definition of rogue, but I suppose I interpreted that as ostensibly people who work for an organization, but not necessarily with it.
Yeah.
So being employed in some fashion, but not necessarily representing its goals.
Yeah, no, that's a good definition. So the way I'm using it anyway, a rogue is an operative within an organization whose action plan is his or her own set of priorities, not the priorities and mandates of the organization itself. And in pure organization theory, one of the things that I have in mind in writing this book is that there was a generation of organizational theorists who looked at organizations as being inherently rational. It kind of comes from Weber, the idea that an organization is a system of rules, it is well organized, it is well designed, and then you have operatives at various levels. You have actors at various levels, but the actors are carrying out the roles which have been defined for them. Well, what's wrong with that picture? What's wrong is what we saw in the strategic action field material that we read a couple of weeks ago, a month ago, and also in the French sociologist, whatever his name was, fascinating theory, the French sociologist, you remember who I'm talking about, who also wrote about the way that organizations work with lots and lots of agency on the part of the individuals within the organization. People pursuing their own agendas, sometimes coordinated with the organization's own priorities and sometimes not coordinated. That's why I refer to rogues. But what we're getting here from this preliminary paragraph is the idea that an organization is not one rational brain. It is instead an agglomeration of multiple centers of activity, knowledge gathering, decision-making, and action. And so the organization, later on, I'm going to give you the quote, which brings in the slime mold again. But the organization is actually behaving in a way which is, I think there's a term in biology, multi-headed, multicephalic. It has multiple heads, multiple brains. An organization has multiple brains. It has multiple centers of action. I kind of doubt any of you have had experience with a large corporation like Ford Motor Company. As chancellor at Dearborn, I had a lot of interaction with Ford Motor Company and with senior officers like vice presidents of different divisions or presidents of different divisions. And one of the things which I came to see, in fact, they were quite explicit. In fact, I had a little group of retired Ford officials whom I composed at Dearborn as kind of a discussion group, basically. So these were people who had retired from senior positions at Ford Motor Company. And I was basically asking them, how does it work? How does Ford Motor Company work in manufacturing, in product design, in sales and marketing, in credit, the different major business divisions of Ford Motor Company? Is it a smoothly designed, smoothly functioning whole? And if you want to make people laugh who have been organizational actors, ask them that question, because the answer is no, it's not at all smoothly functioning. Engineering in Ford, the engineering of new products, it does its thing. And factory design that group does its thing. They take product designs from the product designers, and they then implement in factory systems to build those trucks. It's almost all trucks now, surprise. But the point I'm getting at is that Ford Motor Company is not a unitary, rational decision-making organization. It has a loose kind of rationality. And I think I have a quote coming up in a minute. Maybe I'll see if it's the next one. Yeah, this is a good quote. In fact, this probably says it better than I would paraphrase. So let me read this quote. This is from a different article. You haven't read this article. It's called, it came out about a year ago, Organizations as Actors in the Journal of Philosophy of the Social Sciences. So here's the overall summary I offer. These considerations about what organizations do suggest a theory of organizational rationality that parallels Herbert Simon's theory of bounded rationality for individual decision makers. Organizational thinking is often locally rational. So the marketing people are being, pretty much goal-directed and rational in their decision-making, locally rational. But the decision-making for the whole corporation proceeds through a distributed system of actors and offices that are disjointed in their intentions and purposes. What's good for Ford Credit is not necessarily good for manufacturing. And what's good for manufacturing is not necessarily good for safety control and so forth. So there are disjointed intentions and purposes. The priorities and objectives themselves of the corporation lack unity and stability. The processes of organizational thinking are frequently influenced by extraneous factors. These processes depend upon selective and incomplete information. That sounds very much like Herbert Simon, limitations on information. There is commonly incomplete communication across divisions, for example, manufacturing versus the Ford Credit. And the results of this kind of dispersed knowledge and action are rarely coherent over the whole organization. Now I'm illustrating this as I read through the quote with Ford Motor Company, but now put in the Department of Justice, where one division of the Department of Justice is pursuing one agenda, working very hard at that agenda, and another division is working on something quite different, but which intersects sometimes, and sometimes intersects in a way which is not favorable to a good outcome for the Department of Justice as a whole. We might refer to this interpretation of collective knowledge gathering and action processes. Now I'm introducing kind of a technical term, bounded, localistic, organizational rationality. Think about that for a second. So what I'm asserting is government agencies, governments as a whole, and corporations, and maybe universities as well, are rational in a limited sense. They have bounded, localistic, organizational rationality. And now the critical sentence, a large organization is in some ways more like a slime mold than it is like a control algorithm in a factory proceeding through a series of, the slime mold proceeds through a series of semi-myopic steps responding to changing demands and conditions with poor overall direction. This Jabber quote is it's a reference to the slime mold stuff, so not really relevant to the passage as a whole. So what I'm paraphrasing here is if you take this seriously, then you will automatically not have a lot of confidence in the overall good decision-making capacity of any large organization, whether it's a university or a corporation, profit-oriented corporation, or a government agency. Not because bad people are doing it, not because dumb people are doing it, but rather because it is this distributed kind of decision-making process where agents in different locations have different information sets and different priorities, basically. So they favor one outcome rather than another outcome. Let me pause here for a second and ask, is this at all plausible to you? Or do you think, your own intuitions about organizations, do you think that organizations are more rational than what I'm asserting here?
Hey, Dan.
Mm-hmm.
how is this different from saying a government or an entity like a government is fragmented?
Well, I think that would be a correct statement given what I'm saying here, that a government is fragmented, meaning it's not unitary. So yeah, you're right. That's a fair statement. I've got two diagrams. When I said to Emily she needed to have a bunch of arrows, I've got arrows in my diagram. So I prepared these diagrams actually first for the article I just was quoting from, Organizations as Actors, and the journal really didn't want to have diagrams, so I dropped it from there, and then I dropped it from the book also. But the idea that I've got here is to try to do something that graphically represents an organization in a way which is more veridical, more accurate than a organizational chart. CEO, vice presidents, legal team, you know what an organizational chart looks like. This is somewhat more amorphous, but the organization has what I refer to as arrangements, which includes mission and function. Where does the mission and function come from? Well, that's an interesting question that we can pursue. A corporation which has just been founded has been designed with a particular mission and function already established. But a corporation like IBM, which has existed now for 120 years probably, something like that, its mission and function has actually changed a lot over the past 120 years in very substantial ways. So mission and function needs to be discovered. Resources, what resources can the organization, can the leadership, can the actors within the organization call upon? Then rules. An organization consists of a set of rules. If you travel on company business, you must present travel receipts. That would be a rule. If you are going to take files home with you, you must sign them out with the registrar. That would be a rule. And what's the purpose of the rules of an organization? The rules are designed to avoid the kinds of things that Diane Vaughan is specifying: failures, mistakes, errors, and catastrophes. So the idea is that the rules of an organization, the rules of conduct within the organization, these have been designed by, once again, various players for various purposes to regulate conduct both of individuals and of subunits in such a way as to avoid bad outcomes for the organization. But here again, we can talk about fragmentation, as Yilun was just saying. Fragmentation because some of the rule makers may be especially concerned about corruption. And so they may have a real knack for writing anti-corruption rules. And others may be more concerned about bullying. And so they may write rules about HR rules, human resources rules about bullying and harassment. In other words, the exact shape which the rules which govern behavior within the organization, it's very contingent, and very much subject to different sets of priorities by different rule makers. Practices, what are the practices? Well, it turns out, what is kind of obvious if you think about it for 5 minutes, that the rules do not generate behavior. If you go to work for the Coca-Cola company as a mid-level manager, and one of the rules is that you will never speak to the press about any chemical problems that we've had with the Coke formula. That's a rule. Well, the practice may well be, we see this in government agencies anyway, okay, well, I'll secretly talk to the press, but non-attributable. I will be a secret source to the press, but not a public source to the press. In other words, the practices may deviate from the rules. Does that seem likely enough to you? What about practices within the university? What about practices of hiring, for example? Specific formal rules of hiring exist, but sometimes institutions, and especially institutions which are not functioning very well, may disregard their own rules. They may have their own practices. There may be an anti-nepotism rule, can't hire the immediate family of a senior officer, which may be just kind of put aside. And the practice is, if the senior officer has an important member of her family who needs a job, then we'll find a job in the company. That would be a practice rather than a rule. And then finally, we have the actors. We have the actors, and I've got different sized triangles here representing different kind of levels of authority, but it's just kind of a mess. There are connections kind of all over the place, representing the fact that a corporation or a government agency is a social network. It has a certain amount of hierarchy. So supervisors supervise individual actors, and vice presidents supervise multiple units. But within those zones of supervision, there's lots of range for individual initiative and action, all the way out to rogue behavior. So what's on the left and the right, these are derived from the kind of the latest organizational theory thinking. Scott and Davis, I think a couple of weeks ago, you read some of them when we talked about organizations. But there's the idea of the fact that an organization does not exist in a vacuum. Rather, there are important environmental factors, whether it's the market, state regulation, competitors, media, public reaction, other external reactors. So that's represented in my diagram. And then finally, there's performance. And what is performance? Well, if the FDA, the Food and Drug Administration, has gone 3 years and has approved a dozen drugs, each of which has had a serious problem and has killed a whole bunch of people, that's generally considered bad performance. And that will be noticed, and there should be a feedback effect from the performance outcomes to the internal arrangements. Here's a thought question for you. What is the function, what is the mission and function of the Nuclear Regulatory Commission? It is, I'll answer it, it is to ensure that nuclear power plants are safe to the nth degree for the public and the workers. So safety for the public and the workers is the responsibility of the Nuclear Regulatory Commission. Now, roll forward over a 10-year period and find that the Nuclear Regulatory Commission has missed important breakdowns in nuclear power plants around the country. One especially important one is called Davis-Besse. You'll find it important because for half of you, it's about 75 miles away from where you are currently. Anybody who's currently in Asia doesn't have to worry about the Davis-Besse plant, but if we're in Michigan, it came very close to blowing up its radioactive fuel because of a failure of inspections over a 2 or 3 year period of time. So the NRC's performance was very poor. And so we might say the public or the legislators will force changes. Did that happen? No, it didn't happen. The dysfunctions which led to poor oversight of Davis-Besse continue to this day. Anybody nervous about that? Anybody thinking, oh my gosh, are we going to have a nuclear, Fukushima style accident in the United States because of dysfunctions at the Nuclear Regulatory Commission? And a lot of the experts that I've used in my other Ann Arbor class believe that it's just a matter of time before we will have a major nuclear power plant disaster, in part because Nuclear Regulatory Commission suffers from serious dysfunctions, which we can talk about. Lucas, yeah, go ahead.
How do we redress such dysfunctions, right? So
Excellent question.
Does that power lie in the collective hands of some kind of coalition or group of individuals who come together and protest, or does that have to come from structural changes?
So we're kind of back over to the left side of the diagram. The external actors may include people who live within 60 miles of a nuclear power plant, who are able to get themselves, you guessed it, organized as a grievance group And this has happened at nuclear establishments in different parts of the country, where a lot of local pressure has been applied to the company, the producer, in Ohio in particular. Davis-Besse is in Ohio, but in New York State and in California. So that's one possibility, that the failures of NRC or the failures of the nuclear industry can be addressed through pressure from nonprofit organizations, external actors like that. Another possibility is the media, the press. So these are all possibilities, but the state is probably the more persistent alternative. So you might imagine bringing concerns. In fact, there's a wonderful video I use in the other course. It's testimony to the House Energy Committee, or maybe it's the Senate Energy Committee, learning that the NRC did or did not do in the aftermath of Fukushima. And the chief nuclear scientist for, what's it called? The Organization of Nuclear Scientists. That's not quite the correct term, but it's the leading nuclear advocacy group of scientists. So these are fact-based, science-driven advocates. And the top scientist in that group was offering his testimony to the senators. So the idea is, okay, now we have poor performance leading to testimony in front of a Senate committee, leading to improvement in the arrangements of the Nuclear Regulatory Commission, which did not happen. What is the failure in the Nuclear Regulatory Commission? Well, it is corporate and business capture. Business and the nuclear industry, the energy industry, doesn't own the Nuclear Regulatory Commission, but it has a huge amount of influence over the Nuclear Regulatory Commission. So the pressure in the United States to avoid excessive regulation, if you have paid any attention to American politics since Ronald Reagan, the drumbeat of conservative and Republican government has been get rid of regulation. Regulation kills business. Regulation is a business killer. And the Nuclear Regulatory Commission, I mean, it seems kind of crazy. Doesn't it seem crazy that in this particular industry, you would be trading off economic, favor the industry versus protect the public, given the awesome negative consequences which a nuclear disaster can lead to. And yet the Nuclear Regulatory Commission, I think it's pretty demonstrable, NRC has been intimidated from writing more stringent regulations. A very clear example, at Fukushima, one of the causes of failure is that the regulatory officials and the TEPCO, Tokyo Power, in building Fukushima, made their seawall assumptions, their tsunami assumptions, on the basis of a predictable worst case. What falls within the range of likely outcomes, let's say 1 in 1,000 outcomes or 1 in 10,000 outcomes. And the 1 in 10,000 outcome scenario says you might have a tsunami of 30 feet. So they built a 30-foot or 35-foot seawall to protect Fukushima. Other Earth scientists said, yeah, and there's a 1 in 100,000 likelihood of a 50-foot tsunami. That was out of design consideration. And so the 30 or 35-foot seawall was chosen. And of course, what happened in the earthquake? Well, it was a 50-foot tsunami, which led to a catastrophic meltdown of 3 reactors at the Fukushima site. Well, the learning which NRC was asked to do by the Union of Concerned Scientists, now I've got the phrase right, Union of Concerned Scientists, their urging was that NRC should work not with design basis accidents, but beyond design basis accidents. In other words, not the 35-foot tsunami, but the 50-foot tsunami. And the Senate committee and then the NRC concluded that that was too costly, that this would impose too much of a financial burden on the nuclear industry. Can't expect a nuclear industry to cover the cost of the, metaphorically, the 50-foot seawall. So we're not going to go outside the design basis. Well, I'm answering Lucas's question. That's what would substantially improve the safety of American reactors, but it was simply politically impossible to create that, that change. So we're going to have to stop in just a minute. I'm going to see if I have anything else that I really want to emphasize. This diagram I'm going to skip. Sources of dysfunction. I've got a handful of them that you've been exposed to. Principal agent problems. I think we've talked about this problem a couple times, but a principal agent problem is I'm the vice president for manufacturing. I want to be sure nobody gets caught in a sanding machine. And so I send out the order to all supervisors, put up wire mesh around the sanding machines. The supervisors, on the other hand, are way beyond my control, and they find that too time consuming, and it interferes with their own metrics of success, and so they don't do it. That's a principal agent problem. The principal wants X done. The agent, the supervisor in this case, doesn't choose to do X. And it's practically impossible to supervise the supervisor. So principal agent problems, I talk about that quite a bit, both in government and also in private organizations. Loose coupling is a very interesting problem. It's the idea that within an organization, different units may be either tightly coupled, so a change in this part of the organization leads very quickly to a change in that part. Tight coupling can lead to catastrophic failure, but loose coupling can lead to sluggish ability to respond to a crisis. So both loose coupling and tight coupling can be a source of problem. And what does that say? Well, what it says is we need to understand how loose coupling or tight coupling within an organization can create its own problems. Different kinds of conflicts, conflicting priorities of leaders, vice presidents who, one group who favor profitability and cost, and another group who favor safety and protecting the public. Those are conflicting priorities. Conflicts of interest, where some important decision makers may have stock interests, which lead them to favor company policies, which are not in the interest of the company, but are in the interest of their own stock position. And then the possibility, it's kind of a possibility that Diane Vaughan is referring to, muddled coordination and communication in the internal workings of the corporation or the agency. And this is the, let's see, could I end this? Yeah, I think I can use this as the last one. We've already talked about Vaughan. So this is the kind of concluding statement in the chapter that you read in the new social ontology. These observations should not be understood to support the strident view that government is inherently incapable of acting coherently. This is certainly not the case. Rather, the point is that every human institution, public, private, spiritual, charitable, voluntary, military, or educational, is made up of individuals who have their own states of agency and their own goals and preferences. And it is impossible for an organizational structure to function as an idealized and unitary machine of collective activity. And it's a huge ontological mistake to assume that a government agency or a corporation like Ford Motor Company can be unitary in this way. Instead, leaders must attempt to create organizational and motivational arrangements that work best to minimize the dysfunctional propensities created by these facts of disunity. This is partly what I was getting at when I said that Diane Vaughan's book, or her article, is, in a way, it's kind of behind the curve in organizational studies, because there's a lot more that can be done under the category of the final sentence here. Leaders must attempt to create organizational arrangements that work best to minimize dysfunctional propensities. There are a couple of different approaches to this, but probably the most famous one is called high reliability organizations. And it's a whole theory of how organizations can use redundancy and attention to the priority of safety above other business priorities in such a way as to minimize the likelihood of a 3 Mile Island or a Fukushima. So the, I guess we gotta pull it together and stop, But the reason for reading this, this part of my book is simply to give you a kind of a concrete and practical illustration of the fact that philosophy of social science can actually, I think, do some important substantive research work. I think we can do better political science, better what's it called, organizational study, better public administration study, if we kind of think through these problems of actor-centered organizations, the kind of multiplicity, the fragmentation of government and non-governmental organizations. Once we really embrace the heterogeneity that is represented by that social ontology, we're then led to both look for the details of how these organizations actually work, but also we're led to this final sentence of kind of redesigning our institutional arrangements in such a way as to minimize the likelihood of a catastrophic outcome, minimize the likelihood of a Fukushima type failure in the United States or in France or in Germany or in China. I don't believe that China has had a major nuclear disaster. I'm not aware of one, but really the odds are that it will occur. And therefore it's really important for Chinese thinkers, Chinese business and government and regulatory thinkers to be thinking in exactly these same terms. It's not a capitalism versus communism issue, it's an organizational issue which really needs to be addressed directly. Okay, I have thoroughly enjoyed having this course with you. You're just a wonderful group of people to talk about these and discuss these issues. I'm looking forward to reading your papers. I put up a little bit of additional instruction, at least where to submit your papers, which is through the assignment function on Canvas. That's the most convenient way for me to be sure I haven't missed your paper. And I've also got the refreshed deadlines for all of your work. Formally the 16th, a week from today, sorry, the 26th, a week from today, but kind of hard deadline in order for me to get the grade submitted on time is the 30th, the end of the month and the end of that week. So I look forward to seeing your written work. I look forward also, I hope, to having further contact with you after the semester is over. And again, I express a real pleasure in having spent the semester with you. I just wish we could have had a social event, but maybe occasion will permit sometime in the fall. So thank you to all of you. I will make myself available still for an office hour on Monday, just in case people need to. And if you have a question or want to have a conversation, just drop me a note. I'm very happy to talk with all of you individually. Okay, good night. Be well.
Thank you. Take care.
Thank you, Dan.
Yeah, thank you,
Yeah.
Dan. Bye.
Yeah,
Jen.
Thanks
Been
everyone.
great.
Yes.
Thank you.
Thanks
Great
everybody. Yeah.
semester.
Bye.
Thank you.
Take care.
Be well.